The gunshot woke Olivia Owens at dawn, but it was only a rabbit for the breakfast pot, and she pressed her palm to her racing heart and reminded herself that danger and deliverance walked hand in hand out here on the high plains, and a woman had better learn the difference or go mad before Fort Laramie. She climbed from beneath her wagon into the cool May morning of 1852, smoothing her dark hair back under her bonnet and breathing the sage-scented air that stretched unbroken to every horizon. The wagon train had been on the trail for 3 weeks now. 22 families and their hopes packed into canvas and oak, rolling west from Independence toward the Oregon Territory. Olivia traveled with her uncle's family, the Bainbridges. After her father's death last winter left her with little choice but to follow her only living relatives toward whatever new life waited beyond the mountains. The camp stirred to life around her. Fires crackled. Children stumbled sleepy-eyed from their beds. Cattle lowed in the morning chill. And there, riding the perimeter on a gray gelding that moved like smoke over the grass, was Zachary Graves, the wagon train scout and the man who had filled her dreams with such alarming frequency that she had taken to sleeping with her quilt pulled over her mouth, lest she embarrass herself in the night. He sat his horse with the easy authority of a man born to the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun, his hat pulled low. He was perhaps 30 years old, weathered and quiet, with gray eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. The families trusted him completely. Wagon Master Calloway deferred to his judgment on every question of route and timing. Even the unruly Stevens boys minded their tongues when Zachary Graves turned those steady eyes their way. Olivia had noticed him the first day on the trail, but it was the second week before she understood that noticing had become something more dangerous, something that made her pulse quicken when he rode past her wagon or dismounted to check their wheel hubs with those capable hands. She busied herself with breakfast, helping her Aunt Beatrice fry salt pork and cornmeal mush while her Uncle Silas and the 3 Bainbridge boys hitched the oxen. The work was familiar now, a rhythm she had learned quickly because there was no alternative. Out here, uselessness was a luxury no one could afford. "That scout is watching our wagon again," her cousin Margaret whispered, 14 years old and alert to every possibility of romance the way a sunflower tracked the light. "I think he is sweet on you, Olivia." "Hush," Olivia said, but her cheeks warmed. "He watches every wagon. That is his job." "Not like that, he does not," Margaret insisted, grinning. "He looks at you like you are water and he has been walking through sand." Olivia shushed her more firmly and focused on the skillet, but her heart betrayed her with its foolish hammering. She had caught Zachary looking her direction more than once, though he always glanced away before their eyes could properly meet. A man like that, self-contained and watchful, would not waste his attention idly. But whether his interest was simple courtesy or something more, she could not say. They had never exchanged more than a handful of words. The wagon train rolled out at first light, as it did every morning, the line stretching long across the prairie. Olivia walked beside her uncle's wagon for the first miles, as most of the women did, saving the oxen's strength for later in the day when the heat rose and the hours dragged. The grass grew thick and green here, rippling in waves to the horizon, and meadowlarks sang from hidden perches. It was beautiful country, vast and indifferent, and it made Olivia feel very small and very alive all at once. Around mid-morning, Zachary Graves rode back along the train on some errand, his gelding picking its way past the wagons with barely a touch to the reins. As he passed the Bainbridge wagon, his eyes found Olivia, held for a heartbeat, then slid away as if burned. But in that brief moment, she saw something flicker in his expression, something raw and unguarded before his face shuddered again into its customary calm, her breath caught. She stumbled on a tuft of grass and caught herself against the wagon wheel, and when she looked up again, he was already 30 yards ahead, riding toward the front of the train. "Careful, girl," Uncle Silas called down from the driver's seat. "We have not the medicine to waste on a twisted ankle." "I am fine," she said, but her voice came out thin. That night they circled the wagons near a creek lined with cottonwoods, and Olivia helped prepare the evening meal with her mind only half present. She kept replaying that look, trying to parse its meaning. Men did not look at women that way without reason. But Zachary Graves held himself apart from everyone on the train, polite but distant, and she could not imagine him breaking that reserve for her or anyone else. After supper, the families gathered for the evening socializing that broke the monotony of the trail. Someone produced a fiddle. A few couples danced. The children played tag among the wagons until the darkness swallowed their laughter. Olivia sat with the other young women, mending a torn apron and half listening to their chatter about bows and homesteads, and the lives they hoped to build in Oregon. She did not see Zachary anywhere. He often took the late watch, riding the perimeter while the camp slept, and she supposed he was already at his post, alone in the darkness as he seemed to prefer. Later, rolled in her blankets beneath the wagon, she lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. The wind whispered through the grass. Coyotes sang their wavering songs in the distance. Above her, through the wagon's undercarriage, she could see a slice of stars so thick and bright they looked like spilled milk across black velvet. Her thoughts drifted, softened, and eventually became dreams. She did not know what she dreamed exactly, only that it was warm and safe and filled with a voice that said her name like a prayer. Somewhere in that dream she spoke, though she would not remember it come morning, and the words that left her lips were simple and damning. "Zachary," she murmured into the darkness. "Stay." She did not wake. She did not hear the hoofbeats pause on the far side of the circled wagons or the sudden indrawn breath of the man who sat his horse not 20 feet away, frozen in the saddle as if lightning struck. She did not see the way his hands tightened on the reins, or the way his shoulders drew back as though someone had placed a crown on his head, or the way he sat there for a full minute, hardly breathing, before he finally urged his horse forward into the night again. But if she had been awake to see his face, she would have witnessed something breaking open that had been locked shut for a very long time, and she would have known that the look he had given her that morning was only a pale shadow of what he felt now, hearing his name on her sleeping lips. Zachary Graves rode the perimeter 3 times that night instead of 2, and he sat taller in the saddle than he had in 5 years, and he did not speak a word of what he had heard to anyone, because hope was the most dangerous thing a man could carry, and he had already buried more than his share. The days rolled forward with the wagon wheels, measured in miles and monotony. They crossed creeks and dry washes, navigated gullies and grasslands, and the landscape slowly began to shift as the flat prairie gave way to rolling hills. The weather stayed fair, which the wagon master declared a blessing, and the train made good time toward Fort Laramie. Olivia found herself increasingly aware of Zachary's presence, which was difficult because he seemed to be near the Bainbridge wagon more often than strictly necessary. He checked their axles twice in 3 days. He brought news of the trail ahead directly to Uncle Silas rather than passing it through the wagon master. He helped young Thomas Bainbridge, who was only 8, retrieve a runaway chicken without being asked, and he did it all with that same quiet competence that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. But she noticed changes in him nonetheless. He rode differently now, straighter, with a kind of suppressed energy that had not been there before. And when their eyes met, as they did with increasing frequency, he no longer looked away quite so quickly. Instead, he held her gaze for a moment, then two, and something passed between them that needed no words, though Olivia could not have named it if her life depended on it. "He is courting you," Margaret declared one evening as they washed dishes by the creek. "In his way." "He has not said 2 words to me," Olivia protested, but her heart thrilled at the possibility. "Men like that do not court with words," her cousin said wisely, as if her 14 years had made her an expert on the species. "They court with actions. And he acts like a man who has staked a claim and is waiting for the right moment to say so." Olivia wanted to dismiss the notion, but she could not, because she had begun to hope the same thing herself, and hope was a dangerous companion on a journey this long and uncertain. The next evening, Zachary appeared at their fire just after supper, his hat in his hands, and asked if he might speak with Uncle Silas about the trail ahead. The 2 men walked a short distance away, their voices low, and Olivia tried not to watch while her aunt gave her a knowing smile. When Zachary returned to the fire, Uncle Silas was with him, and both men looked pleased about something. Silas cleared his throat in that formal way he had when he was about to make a pronouncement. "Mr. Graves here has offered to teach young Thomas some tracking skills, as the boy has expressed an interest," Silas said. "I have agreed, provided it does not interfere with his chores." Thomas whooped with joy, and Margaret shot Olivia a triumphant look that said, "See? He is finding reasons to come around." But then Zachary turned to Olivia directly, and her breath stopped, because this was the first time he had addressed her with full intention, and his gray eyes were steady on hers. "Miss Owens," he said, his voice low and careful, "I wonder if you might walk with me a moment. There is something I would like to show you if you are willing." Her tongue felt thick in her mouth. She managed a nod, and then she was standing, smoothing her skirts, and her aunt was beaming, and she followed Zachary Graves away from the firelight into the deepening dusk, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. He led her to the edge of the camp, where the wagons gave way to open prairie, and stopped there with the last light of sunset painting the world in shades of gold and violet. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood with his hands loose at his sides, looking out at the horizon as if searching for words he had misplaced. "I am not good at this," he finally said, still not looking at her. "Talking. I have been alone a long time by choice, and I have forgotten the way of it if I ever knew it to begin with." "You are doing fine," Olivia said softly, though her pulse raced. He shook his head. "I am making a mess of it, but I wanted you to know that I see you. I have seen you since the first day. You walk with your chin up even when you are tired. You help everyone who needs it without being asked. You do not complain, though I know this journey is hard on you. You are strong in a way that has nothing to do with muscle, and I admire that. I admire you." The words tumbled out as if he had been holding them back for weeks, and perhaps he had. Olivia stared at him, her eyes stinging with sudden, foolish tears, because no one had ever said anything like that to her, and she had not known how badly she needed to hear it. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a great deal to me." Now he did look at her, and the vulnerability in his face nearly undid her. "I heard you," he said quietly, 3 nights ago. You spoke in your sleep. You said my name." The blood drained from Olivia's face and then rushed back in a scalding wave. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks, mortified beyond measure. "Oh, no. Oh, I am so sorry. I did not mean to. I do not even remember." "I do not be sorry," he interrupted, and his voice was fierce with something that sounded almost like desperation. "Do not. I have been walking on air for 3 days, trying to work up the courage to tell you. I thought maybe it meant something. I hoped it did. I have been too afraid to ask, because if I was wrong, I do not know what I would do with that disappointment." She lowered her hands slowly, staring at him, and everything she felt must have been written plain on her face because his expression transformed. A slow dawn of understanding and relief that made him look 10 years younger. "You are not wrong," she said, her voice barely audible. "I do think of you. I have been thinking of you. I did not mean to say your name aloud, but I cannot pretend I do not care for you because I do. Very much." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night, and for a moment, Olivia thought he might reach for her. But he restrained himself, only nodding once, as if sealing a promise. "Then I would like to court you properly, Miss Owens," he said. "If you will allow it. I know we are on the trail and there is not much I can offer in the way of proper courting, but I want to do this right. I want you to know my intentions are honorable." "Yes," she said, and laughed a little at how simple it was after all the wondering and waiting. "Yes, I would like that very much." They stood there in the gathering darkness, smiling at each other like fools, and then he offered her his arm and walked her back to the fire. And the look on Aunt Beatrice's face said she had witnessed the whole thing from her vantage point by the wagon and approved wholeheartedly. That night, Olivia lay awake for hours, too happy to sleep, and when she finally did drift off, her dreams were filled with gray eyes and steady hands and a voice that said her name like a promise he intended to keep. Over the following days, Zachary courted her as well as a man could on a wagon train crawling across the high plains. He brought her wildflowers he found on his morning rides, small bunches of prairie roses and lupine that she pressed between the pages of her mother's Bible. He rode beside her wagon in the afternoons, telling her about the country they were crossing, the landmarks ahead, the way the land changed as they moved west. He taught young Thomas tracking, as promised, but he also lingered after the lessons to talk with Olivia, their conversations growing longer and easier as they learned each other's rhythms. She learned that he had grown up in Kentucky, that he had come west as a young man seeking adventure and found more hardship than he had bargained for. She learned that he was a skilled hunter and tracker, that he read poetry when he could get his hands on it, and that he had a dry sense of humor that revealed itself in small, unexpected moments. What she did not learn, because he did not speak of it, was the shadow that lived behind his eyes, the flinch he tried to hide whenever they approached a river crossing, the way he grew quiet and distant when the talk turned to families and children. But she sensed it, the old wound he carried, and she was patient, waiting for him to trust her enough to share it. They had been on the trail for 5 weeks when the land turned drier, the grass thinning and the creeks growing scarce. Wagon Master Calloway announced they would need to make a long push to reach the next reliable water source, and the mood in the camp grew tense. Water barrels were checked and rechecked. The cattle began to low with thirst. The sun beat down without mercy, and the dust rose in choking clouds from the wagon wheels. Zachary spent those days ranging far ahead, searching for any water source they might have missed on the maps, and when he returned each evening, his face was grim. The creek they had been counting on was dry, he reported. They would need to push on to the Platte River, still 2 days away if the oxen held up. Olivia watched the worry etch itself into his features, watched him take responsibility for every family, every child, every animal on the train as if their survival rested solely on his shoulders. She saw the weight of it bending him, and she understood that this was who he was, a man who carried others' burdens because he had been unable to carry his own when it mattered most. On the second waterless day, little Thomas Bainbridge fell ill with fever, and Aunt Beatrice grew pale with worry as the boy tossed and burned in the wagon bed. They rationed water to him in small sips, trying to bring the fever down, but he only grew worse as the hours passed. That evening, Zachary appeared at their wagon with his canteen, and he poured half his own water ration into a cup and handed it to Beatrice. "For the boy," he said, "I will manage." "We cannot take your water," Silas protested, but Zachary cut him off with a look. "The boy needs it more than I do," he said flatly. "I have gone longer without. Give it to him." Olivia felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched him walk away, his shoulders set with determination, and she knew in that moment that she loved him, fully and irrevocably, and that whatever darkness he carried, she wanted to help him bear it. They reached the Platte River the next afternoon, and the sight of that wide, muddy water brought a cheer from the exhausted travelers. The cattle smelled the water and quickened their pace, and the wagon train rolled down to the river's edge in a state of profound relief. But Olivia noticed that Zachary did not share the general jubilation. He sat his horse at the river's edge, staring at the brown current with an expression that looked almost like dread, and when Wagon Master Calloway rode up to discuss the crossing, Zachary's voice was tight and controlled in a way she had never heard before. "The water is high," he said. "Higher than it should be this time of year. There must have been storms upstream. We will need to be careful." "Can we ford it?" Calloway asked. Zachary was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. "Yes," he finally said, "but we will need to double-team the wagons and go slow. No mistakes." There was something in his voice that made Olivia's stomach clench with unease, but the crossing began, and there was no more time for questions. The first few wagons made it across without incident, the oxen straining against the current, the drivers shouting encouragement, the wheels creaking through the muddy riverbed. But the Platte was deceptive, its bottom treacherous with shifting sand, and when the Stevens wagon reached the deepest part of the channel, one of the oxen stumbled and the wagon lurched sideways, its load shifting dangerously. Zachary was in the water in an instant, his horse plunging through the current, and he caught the wagon's side and held it steady while the Stevens family scrambled to redistribute the weight, and the oxen found their footing again. The wagon righted itself and continued across, and a ragged cheer went up from the watching families. But Olivia saw that Zachary's face had gone white as bone, his breathing ragged. He stayed in the river, though, helping each wagon across, positioning himself at the deepest point where the current ran strongest. And Olivia understood that he was forcing himself to face something that terrified him, that this was costing him more than anyone else could see. The Bainbridge wagon was one of the last to cross. Uncle Silas drove the oxen into the water with Beatrice, and the children huddled in the wagon bed, and Olivia walked alongside, holding her skirts high, her heart hammering with each step as the water rose to her knees, then her waist. They were halfway across when she felt the current shift, a sudden surge that made her stagger, and then the wagon lurched and the oxen bellowed and everything became chaos and cold water and fear. She went under, the current dragging her sideways, her heavy skirts pulling her down, and she had one moment of pure terror in which she thought, "This is how I die," before strong hands closed around her arms and hauled her up into the air. Zachary had her, his grip like iron, his face inches from hers as he dragged her toward the wagon and shoved her up onto the driver's seat beside Silas, who was fighting to control the panicking oxen. The wagon was tilting dangerously. One wheel caught on something beneath the surface, and the current battered against its side, threatening to roll it entirely. "Hold on," Zachary shouted, and then he dove beneath the water, and Olivia's heart stopped because she could not see him, could not tell if he was all right, could only feel the wagon shift and groan beneath her and pray that he would surface again. He did, gasping, and then he was behind the wagon, his shoulder braced against the tilted side, his legs driving through the mud, and with a strength Olivia would not have believed possible, he shoved the wagon upright. The wheel came free of whatever had trapped it. The oxen lurched forward, and the wagon rolled up onto the far bank in a cascade of water and mud and terrified prayers. Olivia collapsed on the seat, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and when she looked back, Zachary was still standing in the river, chest deep, his face a mask of anguish that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She climbed down from the wagon on trembling legs and walked back to the water's edge, and when he finally waded out, she was there, and without thinking, she threw her arms around him and held on as if she could anchor him to the earth by will alone. He stood rigid in her embrace for a heartbeat, then two, and then his arms came around her, and he buried his face against her wet hair and shook with silent, wrenching sobs that tore at her heart. "I lost them in a river," he said against her hair, the words breaking out of him like a long-held poison. "My wife, my daughter, 5 years ago, a crossing like this. I was supposed to keep them safe. I was supposed to protect them. But the current took them, and I could not hold on, and they drowned while I watched. I swore I would never let that happen again. I swore I would never care enough for it to hurt like that again. But then you said my name in your sleep, and I was lost. And when I saw you go under today, I thought I would die if I could not reach you. I thought I would drown in the grief all over again." Olivia held him tighter, her own tears mixing with the river water on her face. "You saved me," she whispered. "You did not let me go. You held on." "I did," he said, and his voice was raw with wonder and relief. "I held on." They stood there on the riverbank, clinging to each other, while the wagon train completed its crossing and the families began to set up camp for the night. Eventually, Aunt Beatrice came and draped a blanket around Olivia's shoulders, and Uncle Silas gripped Zachary's arm in silent thanks, and the world slowly righted itself again. That night, after Olivia had changed into dry clothes and warmed herself by the fire, Zachary came to sit beside her, and he told her everything. About his wife, Rebecca, who had been gentle and kind and had loved him despite his rough edges. About his daughter, Sarah, who had been 4 years old and full of light. About the crossing on the Kansas River where the wagon had overturned and he had managed to save himself but not them, had watched them slip away into the muddy water while he screamed their names. "I blamed myself," he said quietly, staring into the fire. "I still do some days. I became a wagon train scout because I thought if I could keep others safe, it might balance the scales somehow. But I never let myself get close to anyone because I could not bear to risk that kind of loss again." "And then I came along," Olivia said softly. "And then you came along," he agreed, turning to look at her. "And you said my name in your sleep, and I started to hope again, and it terrified me. It still terrifies me. But today, in that river, I had a choice. I could let the fear win, or I could fight for you, and I chose you. I will always choose you, Olivia, if you will have me." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I will have you," she said. "Fear and all, we will carry it together." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and it tasted like river water and hope, and the beginning of something that might, with time and grace, heal them both. The wagon train pressed on toward Fort Laramie, and Zachary Graves courted Olivia Owens with an intensity that made the other families smile and shake their heads in approval. He was a different man now, lighter somehow, as if that river crossing had washed away more than mud and fear. He laughed more easily. He talked more freely. He no longer held himself apart from the life of the train, but joined in the evening gatherings, and more than once Olivia saw him playing with the children, his face soft with a tenderness that must have been buried with his daughter and was now, finally, allowed to surface again. They reached Fort Laramie in late June, the wagons rolling into the fort's shadow with a sense of accomplishment and relief. It was only the halfway point of their journey, but it was a milestone nonetheless, a place to rest and resupply before the hard push over the mountains. Zachary bought Olivia a new bonnet at the fort's trading post, a frivolous expense that made her laugh and scold him, but she wore it proudly, and he looked at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. On their last night at the fort, he asked her to marry him, and he did it properly, on one knee in the shadow of the stockade wall, with a ring he had traded for and a voice that shook with emotion. "I know we have months yet on the trail," he said. "I know we are not even halfway to Oregon. But I do not want to wait any longer to make this official. Marry me, Olivia. Say you will be my wife." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They married 2 days later, in a simple ceremony performed by the fort's chaplain, with the entire wagon train in attendance. Aunt Beatrice wept happily into her handkerchief. Uncle Silas gave Olivia away with a gruff blessing. Young Thomas served as ring-bearer, grinning so wide his face looked ready to split. And when the chaplain pronounced them man and wife, Zachary kissed his bride with such fierce joy that the watching crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The journey west continued, but everything was different now. Olivia rode beside her husband, walked with him in the evenings, slept in his arms beneath the wagon, and felt safer than she had ever felt in her life. He told her stories of his childhood, of his dreams for their homestead, of the house he wanted to build and the life he wanted to give her. She told him about her father, about the grief of losing him, about her hope that somewhere in Oregon they might put down roots and finally belong. The trail grew harder as they climbed into the mountains, the wagon straining over rocky passes and steep descents, but the company was strong, and Zachary's leadership never faltered. He guided them through South Pass, across the Continental Divide, and down into the green valleys of the Oregon Territory, and with each mile, Olivia felt the past falling away behind them, making space for a future that felt as wide and open as the western sky. They reached the Willamette Valley in late September, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn. The wagon train dissolved as families scattered to claim their land and begin the work of building new lives, and Zachary and Olivia filed their claim on a beautiful piece of bottomland near a creek that ran clear and cold, nothing like the treacherous Platte. They built a cabin that first winter, with help from the Bainbridges and other families from the train, and by spring they had a roof and walls and a hearth, and Olivia planted a garden while Zachary cleared fields and built fences. It was hard work, back-breaking and relentless, but they did it together, and at the end of each day they fell into bed exhausted and content, and Zachary held his wife and marveled at the grace that had brought her into his life. Their first child, a daughter, was born the following winter, and they named her Daisy, for the flowers that grew wild in the fields come spring. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and Zachary held her with a tenderness that brought tears to Olivia's eyes, because she knew how much it meant to him to be a father again, to have a second chance at this. 2 years later, a second daughter arrived, and they named her Pearl, because Olivia said she was a treasure, and Zachary could not argue with that. Pearl was a sunny child, quick to laugh and slow to anger, and she adored her older sister with a devotion that bordered on worship. The years rolled on, measured in harvests and birthdays and the slow, steady accumulation of a life well lived. Their farm prospered. Their daughters grew strong and happy. The community around them flourished, and Zachary became known as a man of integrity and skill, someone others turned to for advice and leadership. When Olivia was pregnant with their third child, she told Zachary she hoped for a boy this time, and he smiled and said he would be grateful for whatever the Lord saw fit to send them. But when the baby arrived, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, Zachary held his son and wept with joy, and Olivia knew that this child represented a healing she could not have given him, that only time and grace and the courage to hope again could provide. They named him Lucas, and he grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and track and work the land with the same quiet competence that had first drawn Olivia to Zachary all those years ago on the wagon train. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Olivia on a ride up into the hills above their farm, and they sat together overlooking the valley, watching the sun set over the land they had claimed and the life they had built. "You ever think about that night on the trail?" he asked. "When you said my name in your sleep," Olivia laughed. "I still cannot believe I did that. I was so mortified when you told me." "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, pulling her close. "You gave me permission to hope again. You taught me that love is not something to fear, but something to fight for. You saved me, Olivia, as surely as I pulled you from that river." "We saved each other," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "And we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They sat in silence, watching the light fade and the stars emerge, and Zachary thought about the long journey that had brought them here, from the high plains to this green valley, from grief to hope, from loneliness to love. He thought about the wagon train, the river crossing, the moment he had heard his name on her sleeping lips, and felt his heart begin to beat again after years of numbness. He had ridden taller for weeks after that night, and he rode tall still, not from pride but from gratitude, because he knew how rare it was to be given a second chance at happiness, and he did not intend to waste a single day of it. Their daughters grew and eventually married, settling on farms nearby, and Lucas took over more and more of the farm work as Zachary's joints began to stiffen with age. Grandchildren arrived, a joyful chaos of noise and energy that filled the house with laughter, and Olivia became the matriarch of a growing family, a woman whose love and wisdom drew people to her like a fire on a cold night. On summer evenings, Zachary and Olivia would sit on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands, watching the sun go down over the valley, and they would talk about the years behind them and the years still to come, and they would hold hands like young lovers because the years had only deepened what they felt for each other, had tested it and tempered it and made it into something unbreakable. "I would do it all again," Zachary said one evening when they were both gray and weathered and more than 60 years old, their lives measured in decades rather than days. "Every hard mile of that wagon train, every moment of fear, every river crossing. I would do it all again, just to hear you say my name in the darkness." "And I would say it again," Olivia replied, her eyes bright with tears and joy and a love that had never dimmed. "Every night for the rest of my life, I would say your name, Zachary Graves, because you are my heart and my home, and I am the luckiest woman who ever lived." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and the sun went down over the valley they had claimed all those years ago, and somewhere in the house behind them, their grandchildren laughed and played, and the legacy they had built together continued on, a testament to the power of hope and the courage to love again after loss. The wagon train was long behind them, dust and memory, but Zachary Graves still rode tall, and Olivia Owens still spoke his name with love, and together they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. A family and a farm and a love story that had begun with a whispered name in the darkness and a cowboy who had finally learned to hope again. Years passed, and their family continued to grow and thrive. Lucas married a schoolteacher from Portland, a bright woman named Alice who brought books and learning to the valley, and they gave Zachary and Olivia 5 more grandchildren to spoil and adore. Daisy's children were farmers like their grandfather, working the land with the same dedication he had taught them. Pearl's daughters became skilled seamstresses, their work sought after throughout the valley. The farm became a gathering place for the extended family, especially during harvest time and holidays, when the house overflowed with people and noise, and the particular chaos that comes from multiple generations living and loving under one roof. Olivia cooked vast meals, her kitchen always fragrant with bread and stew and pies, and Zachary presided over the table with quiet pride, his heart full as he looked at the faces of his children and grandchildren, and saw the future he had never dared dream of in those dark years after Rebecca and Sarah's deaths. He never forgot them, his first family, but the grief no longer owned him. He had learned to carry it alongside the joy, to honor what he had lost while celebrating what he had found, and Olivia's love had made that possible. She had given him the courage to open his heart again, to risk the pain of loving, and he would be grateful to her for that until his dying day. On their 20th anniversary, the family threw them a celebration, and neighbors came from miles around to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There was music and dancing and more food than any reasonable gathering required, and at some point in the evening, someone asked Zachary to tell the story of how he and Olivia had met. He looked at his wife across the crowded room, and she smiled at him, and he knew she was remembering the same things he was remembering, the wagon train and the river and the night she had spoken his name in her sleep. "We met on the Oregon Trail," he said simply. "And she taught me how to live again. That is the whole story and the only one that matters." But Olivia stood and crossed the room to him, and she took his hand and added, "He saved my life in a river crossing, and I saved his heart, and we have been saving each other ever since." The room erupted in applause and cheers, and their children and grandchildren crowded around them, and Zachary pulled Olivia into his arms and danced with her the way he had wanted to dance with her on the trail all those years ago, but had been too afraid, too wounded, too convinced that happiness was not meant for him. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer wounded, or at least the wounds had healed enough that he could carry them without stumbling. And he knew now that happiness was not something you earned or deserved, but something you chose, again and again, every day, in small acts of courage and love. As they swayed together to the music, Olivia whispered in his ear, "I am so glad I talked in my sleep that night." Zachary laughed, a sound of pure joy. "So am I, though I rode around terrified for weeks trying to work up the nerve to tell you." "You rode taller," she said. "I noticed." Everyone noticed. "Margaret said you looked like a king on his throne." "I felt like one," he admitted. "You made me feel like I could do anything, be anything, as long as you were beside me." "I am beside you," she said softly. "I will always be beside you." They continued to dance, surrounded by their family and friends, and the music played on into the night, and the years ahead stretched out before them, full of promise and peace. When Zachary was 70 years old, he began to feel his age in earnest, the decades of hard work taking their toll on his body. His hands grew stiff with arthritis. His knees ached in the cold. He moved more slowly, more carefully, but he still rose every morning and went out to check on the farm, because the land was in his blood and he could not imagine a day without it. Olivia, ever practical, insisted he take it easier, and Lucas and his sons took on more of the work, but Zachary remained involved, his mind still sharp even as his body began to fail. He sat on the porch in the afternoons, watching his grandchildren play, and he felt a contentment so deep it bordered on the sacred. One evening, as the sun set over the valley in shades of orange and gold, Olivia came to sit beside him, and they rocked together in comfortable silence, the way they had done for decades. "You have any regrets?" she asked him, her voice soft. He considered the question, turning it over in his mind. "Only one," he finally said. "I wish I could have met you sooner. I wish you could have known me before the grief, when I was younger and less broken." She shook her head. "You were not broken, Zachary, you were wounded. There is a difference. And the man I fell in love with on that wagon train was exactly the man I was meant to love. Grief and all. Because your grief made you compassionate. It made you careful with people's hearts. It made you the kind of man who would wade into a river to save a woman he barely knew, because you could not bear to lose anyone else. I love you," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "I have loved you from the moment I heard my name on your lips, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I know," she said, taking his hand, "and I love you the same way. We have been blessed, Zachary. More than we deserved, perhaps, but blessed nonetheless." They sat together until the stars came out, and then Olivia helped him inside, and they went to bed in the room they had shared for more than 40 years, and Zachary held his wife close and thanked God for the grace that had brought her into his life. He lived another 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, long enough to watch Lucas's oldest son take over the running of the farm, long enough to sit on the porch one last time with Olivia and tell her that his only wish was that she would not grieve too long when he was gone. "I will grieve as long as I need to," she told him firmly, "because you are worth grieving for, but I will not let it destroy me because you would not want that. And I have our children and grandchildren to live for, and they need me." "They do," he agreed, "but not as much as I have needed you. You gave me a life worth living, Olivia. You gave me everything." He passed peacefully in his sleep a week later, with Olivia beside him, holding his hand the way she had held it through every storm and triumph of their long marriage. The valley mourned him because he had been a good man, a pillar of the community, someone who had helped build something lasting and true. They buried him on a hill overlooking the farm, beneath a tall pine tree, and Olivia stood at his grave with her children and grandchildren around her, and she did not cry, because she knew he would not have wanted her tears. Instead, she spoke to him the way she had spoken to him every day of their marriage, with love and honesty and the deep knowing that comes from a lifetime shared. "I will miss you every day," she said, "but I will not be afraid, because you taught me how to be brave. And when my time comes, I will find you again, and we will dance the way we danced at our anniversary, and we will never be apart again." She lived another 10 years, a beloved matriarch surrounded by family, and when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, her children swore they saw her smile, as if she could already see what waited for her on the other side. They buried her beside Zachary, beneath the pine tree on the hill, and the valley remembered them both, the scout and the woman who had loved him, the couple who had met on a wagon train and built a life that endured long after they were gone. Years turned to decades, and decades turned to a century, and the farm passed through the family, each generation adding to what Zachary and Olivia had built. The valley changed and grew, but the story remained, passed down from grandparent to grandchild, a love story that had begun with a whispered name in the darkness, and a cowboy who had ridden taller for weeks because he had finally, against all odds, found hope again. And somewhere in the telling, in the remembering, Zachary Graves and Olivia Owens became more than just people who had lived and died. They became a testament to the power of second chances, to the courage it takes to love after loss, to the belief that even in the hardest journeys, there is grace enough to carry us home. The creek still ran clear and cold past the cabin, which had been expanded and rebuilt, but never abandoned. The fields still produced their harvest each fall. The pine tree on the hill still stood tall over two graves that had long since settled into the earth. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass and the sun set over the valley in shades of gold, you could almost hear it, the echo of a voice speaking a name with love, and the sound of a man riding taller because he had finally learned to hope again.